Okay, guys, so welcome to our session on the Odyssey. I might make this a bit different where I will divide this actually into 3 videos because I want to introduce the text before I delve into the main themes. This will give you a chance to situate the text because this is longer than the Epic of Gilgamesh, and we go into different topics and whatnot. So I wanted to have one lecture that's kind of devoted to introducing you guys to the book, why it's important, why we are reading it, and what exactly are the themes that we are going to discuss. So, last week we talked about why is it that we are reading these books, right? Why is it that we are reading books like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Odyssey of Homer and all of these texts and whatnot. And we said that we're not reading it for historical reasons, right? We're not reading it because we want to know the history of Oedipus or the history of Odysseus or the history of the ancient Greeks. What we want is we want a mirror into, certain themes in the human condition. And we define the human condition as something that is ahistorical, right? Something that is relevant to man in all times and spaces, and something which continuously comes up in different texts and in different theme, literature, film, and so forth. So in the case of the epic, we looked at, for example, that movie, Warm Bodies, and about this idea of what does it mean to be human, and what does it mean to, what is anxiety, what is immortality versus mortality, and how does the idea of death essentially shape the way that we approach life and think of life and define one's purpose. Now, the Odyssey of Homer is very similar in that we are going to look at the same theme, but from a different perspective. So the Odyssey of Homer, let's start off with this, is really us looking at the Odyssey of man. The Odyssey of Homer is us looking at the Odyssey of man. And what is an Odyssey? The Odyssey is a journey. So Homer here stands for mankind, so to speak. And it is an odyssey, a journey towards what? It is a journey of man trying to discover himself, or the journey of the self, towards fulfillment, towards truth, towards knowledge. So you should see this book as being more symbolic and metaphorical than it really is literal, right? So the themes that we are going to discuss are the theme of alienation, the theme of alienation and anguish, the theme of authenticity, choice, and purpose or project. Now, alienation simply stands, and anguish, the state in which you are alienated or in which you are divorced from the truth or you are divorced from yourself. So it is the state in which you are in a identity crisis, right? Now, identity crisis does not necessarily mean that you have two competing identities, but an identity crisis or alienation can be when you are divorced from your true self, right? From your true home, so to speak. Anguish is, of course, the feeling of despair that you have when you are in a state of alienation, right? When you don't know your identity, or you know what your identity is, but you have not been able to fulfill it. And we'll see this theme playing out time and time and time again throughout the text. Okay, we're going to go into this in the next lecture. Again, in this lecture, we're just going to talk about the epic. We're going to give you the background and stuff. Now, authenticity is the state in which you are in line with yourself. You are in line with your purpose. You are in line with what you deem to be the truth. So essentially, any odyssey in this sense is a pursuit of what? It is a pursuit of authenticity. And when we talked about the human condition, remember we talked about this idea of the human condition as being divided into two dimensions. The first dimension is the idea, the question of what am I, right? And this is something we will see Telemachus, the son of Odysseus, will constantly ask, right? Who am I? I.e., who is my father, right? And for Odysseus, he knows what the answer to this question is. I am the king, right? I am a king, and therefore I must return to my homeland. I am the father of Telemachus. I am the husband of what's it called? I am the husband of Penelope, and so forth. So the what am I, right? Who am I, leads to the project of where to, right? The project of where to is basically how man tries to fulfill the truth of himself. The question of authenticity, how man pursues authenticity. So the Odyssey, we can kind of see it as that second question, the where to, right? It is Odysseus trying to fulfill his truth, the where am I, the who am I question, the question of identity, by pursuing and going through all of these obstacles and whatnot. Now, another important theme, like we said, is that the quest towards authenticity is obviously not a smooth journey. Otherwise, we would not need to tell a whole story about it. We would not need to make movies about it. It wouldn't be interesting if there weren't obstacles and if there weren't certain challenges. Now, we're going to come across many of these obstacles, right? And many of these challenges. And one of these challenges and obstacles is choice, like the human capacity to make choices. And what are some of the rocks and some of the obstacles that stand in the way of man and his capacity to make choices? We're going to find that there are certain internal obstacles and there are certain external obstacles, right? There are always internal obstacles that impede your ability to make a choice, right? For example, fear, ignorance, not knowing that you have the capacity to make a choice, a lack of motivation, and so forth. External obstacles can be things such as the power structures that dominate the world that you live in. So it can be politicians, it can be your economic conditions, it can be other people, right? And we'll see this with the case of Odysseus' son and the suitors who occupy the palace. And it can also be the gods, right? In the case of Odysseus, the gods, that some of the gods try to help him make choices and achieve the objectives of the choices that he makes, i.e. reaching home. And some of them will obstruct his capacity to make choices. Now, the most obvious obstacle when we make choices are the limitations that are imposed upon us by nature, right? And we will see how that plays out later in the text, right? When we actually delve into the different themes and we begin interpreting each book. So let's start off with a background to the text. So the Iliad and the Odyssey are divided into two parts. The Iliad discusses the first 10 years of the Trojan War. The Odyssey discusses the 10 years that come after the Trojan War. And there's something very interesting in the division between the Iliad and the Odyssey. So the Iliad discusses Odysseus as a commander, as a general, as a war hero, right? It discusses Odysseus going into battle, right? It discusses Odysseus as a Greek hero and all of his achievements and his cunning intelligence during the 10 years known as the Trojan War. Now, for the modern observer, for the modern man or woman who grew up in the age of Batman and Superman and the fictional depiction of the American GI and Rambo and so forth, one would think that a narrative of the self or an exposition into what is the self, what is the question of what am I and authenticity where to, would be depicted in the 10 years wherein Odysseus is portrayed as a war hero, right? Usually when we want to talk about a journey in the modern world, we look at journeys into war, right? Into fame and achievement and so forth, into battle, right? Like, with the Marvel comics, right? The Marvel comics are never about our superheroes going home, right? Or going back to their wives. They're always about them going to fight some kind of supervillain. Same thing with the Rambo. Rambo is not going home. Rambo is going into battle to save the American Empire or whatever it is. Or what's the name of that boxer? Not Rambo. What's the name of that? The whatever. Anyways, you guys get the point. So this brings us to something that's quite interesting, right? Something that Homer is trying to tell us. Homer is trying to tell us that the journey for the self, the journey for authenticity, actually begins when the war ends, right? And Odysseus is exposed in his raw human form. And that's why the text begins with Odysseus, who is this, again, imagine you're a Greek student reading this when it was first published or first, orally transmitted. It gives us this image of Odysseus, this war hero, this commander, this cunning general, naked on the beaches of Ithaca, right? On the beaches of where he was trapped in with Calypso, right? Crying, right? So Homer wants to tell us this is the state of man. This naked general who is crying and the prisoner of Calypso, basically a sex slave, right? This is human nature and this is the state of man. And he wants to tell us about how Odysseus goes from that state to the state of returning home, right? And then all of the obstacles that he faces. So this is the first important thing to point out. The second, let's kind of relate this back to the epic of the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? Remember that the real story of Gilgamesh begins after Enkidu dies. And it begins when we find Gilgamesh in the state of anguish and despair and crying, and he's wandering, trying to understand his purpose. So similarly, what the writer of the epic was trying to show us is that this is human nature. This is Gilgamesh in his true form. Similarly, we are exposed here to Odysseus in his raw form, in his true form, right? Not in the fictional narratives that people attributed to him, but what Odysseus truly is. So what are we going to discuss? We have books 1 to 4, wherein we have the council of the gods and the situation in Ithaca, right? Then 5 to 12 is about Odysseus' wanderings, his journey, and the obstacles that he faces in trying to attain authenticity, i.e., return to Ithaca. The internal and the external obstacles. Then we have books 13 to 16, where Odysseus is finally outside of the palace and he tries to get in. Book 17 to 22, we have Odysseus inside the palace. And then book 23, finally, Odysseus is in his bedchamber, and we find out we are given a very interesting account in terms of how he finally manages to convince his wife, and here we finally manage to secure his long lost identity. So to break it down, let's see what's next. Okay, before we get to that, what we're going to explore, just to give you guys kind of a summary of the next 3 books that we're going to discuss next week with the themes. In book 1, we have a prologue wherein the gods basically convene and they discuss the issue of Odysseus, and they reach a conclusion that Odysseus is able to leave the island of Calypso and set out back home. In book 2 to 4, we have another narrative, another story that comes up, which is Telemachus, which is his son. So now Homer is introducing us to another storyline that will move in parallel with the story of Odysseus. And it is also a question of who am I, right? Odysseus' son is trying to discover who his identity is and what his origins are and so forth. And he's trying to come to maturity. He is trying to become a man. And in book 5, we return to Odysseus' journey. He builds a raft to leave Calypso's island, and on his way, he is shipwrecked once again, right? And he ends up on the island of Scheria, and then a new set of obstacles begin with that as well. So naturally, before we set out on this journey, the journey of Odysseus' son, Telemachus, or the journey of Odysseus in terms of trying to reach authenticity, or in terms of trying to realize their authenticity in the face of the obstacles, we would have to discuss the setting, the type of world that they live in, right? And by looking at the type of world that they live in, we can then come to understand to what extent is this journey, this Odyssey, a smooth journey, or is it a very obstacle-ridden journey, right? A journey that is not paved smoothly, and that is not designed in the interests of man or Odysseus, but is rather set up in a way as to be against him. So remember with the Epic of Gilgamesh, we saw that the universe, right, the world that Gilgamesh lived in was an unfair world, in the sense that the world was not made for the fulfillment of Gilgamesh. It was made in a very impersonal way. And so there was essentially a dilemma wherein Gilgamesh had to basically assert himself and define his own purpose. We will find with Odysseus, the situation is very similar, right? In the world of Gilgamesh, the world of Odysseus, if we want to talk about the world of Odysseus, it is a world of competing gods. It is not a world of one benevolent God, as in the case with, for example, the Christian faith, which we're going to get to with Augustine, right? In a world of a benevolent God who creates the world in the image of God and in the image of man, we have a world that is designed in such a way wherein man can discover the truth and man can pursue the truth. It's designed in that way. In the same way, for example, a supermarket is designed in such a way where you can find things, right? Imagine if, for example, a supermarket was designed in such a way wherein the cereal section was next to the cat food section, right? The cereal was next to the cat food and the milk was next to, I don't know, the rat poison or whatever, right? It would not be easy to find things, right? In the Christian worldview or in the Islamic worldview, which we assume, right, things are designed in such a way wherein the truth is something that we can discover and something that we can pursue, and we are also given a guide on how to discover the truth and how to pursue the truth and how to connect with God and so forth. Now, in the world of Odysseus, that is not the case. The world was not created in the image of man. It was not created with the interests of man in mind. Nor is it a world of one benevolent God. It is a world of multiple gods who are constantly competing with one another. And these gods are impartial gods, meaning that these gods are gods who have feelings of jealousy, feelings of anger, and so forth. So naturally, what this does is, if you're living in a world wherein the gods are gods who possess feelings of anger and envy, and they compete with one another, then the world is going to be an unstable world. Why? Because there are no longer fixed laws that you can depend on. What do I mean by fixed laws that you can depend on? Odysseus sets out for a journey, right, through the sea. Now, in a world of fixed natural laws, you can assume that there are certain natural laws, right, such as the gravitational pull, wavelengths, that there's a certain finite space between one island and another, that weather patterns are predictable, that the weather raft will float, right, and so forth. So there are a set of natural laws that are predictable that you have access to. Now, what happens when there is a power or a set of powers, which are the gods, who can intervene and change those laws? Clearly, right, what is at stake changes and the nature of the journey changes. So this is the first problematic element, right? That we have gods that are described with human characteristics and they are competing with one another, and their power is stronger than human power, and they intervene in the whole process of cause and effect. And some of these gods act in unjust ways, like Poseidon, for example, right, the god of the sea. And that these gods, unlike, for example, the idea of the Christian God that this God does not rarely intervene into human life, right, through miracles, but rather these gods are constantly engaged in the affairs of man, whether it's in a positive way or a negative way. And so immediately we have the problem, which we're going to discuss, of free will versus fate, right? So the issue of the gods, right, immediately sets up for us the problem of, one second, immediately sets up for us the issue of fate and free will. Now, one of the things that I want you to think about is if you set out to a journey, okay, and you are well aware of the fact, that you do not have free will, what type of anxiety does that create? What type of anguish does that create? Right? If you have been stripped of free will, what does that mean in your pursuit of authenticity and truth? So this is something we're going to look at. So in the world of Odysseus, the truth is ambiguous, free will is ambiguous, and the relationship between the man and the god is a very complex relationship, wherein you do not have a positive relationship, but it is a relationship that is both positive and negative depending on the god that is intervening. Now, sorry, 1 second. So it's my wife telling me that she watches these with me, that I'm wearing a dress shirt and it's obvious that I'm wearing Adidas sweats as well. Yes, that is true, because I am at home and I'm not going to wear dress pants for a lecture. So yes, these are my Adidas sweats, and thank you for pointing that out, wife. Okay, so my wifey Jinan, I put her through the trouble of having to watch these lectures with me, because they're not live, so somebody has to be watching them. So and also she warns me if I'm doing something stupid, like wearing. Anyways, okay, let's get back to the point. So 1 second, I lost track. So let's get back to let's kind of summarize what I was talking about today, just in order to transition into next week. So this is the summary, okay? If you were confused and I got you lost and somewhere between slide 1, slide 4, or the Adidas pants and so forth, this is the summary. The Odyssey of Homer is about the Odyssey of man, i.e. the Odyssey of the self towards the fulfillment of the self. And it is the quest of authenticity. It is the quest wherein man goes from the where to, from the who am I, the where from, to the where to the purpose, man's purpose. And we said that in the Odyssey of Homer, in order for us to understand how this Odyssey takes place, right? From the where from the who am I, to the where to, from Odysseus as this naked, raw man who is weeping on the shore, to Odysseus as a fulfilled, authentic self. In order to understand the nature of this journey and what we will experience on this Odyssey with Odysseus as we move forward, we have to first look at the world that Odysseus occupies. And we said that to understand the world that Odysseus lives in, we look at the man-God relationship. And similar to the epic of Gilgamesh, the relationship, the nature of the world that Odysseus lives in is a very complex world, because we have gods who have human inclinations, who are competing with one another and constantly intervene into the affairs of man. Therefore, life is unpredictable, and there is no really fixed cause and effect or benevolent God who eases the affairs of man, but everything is thrown up into the air, right? And thus we will come across in this Odyssey external obstacles through the gods, and what I had not mentioned, and this is just as important, the internal obstacles, which we will see are the obstacles that are put forth by virtue of Odysseus being a human, his own limitations, his own anger, his anger, for example, his arrogance, his grieving, and so forth. So that is the world through which we are going to move with Odysseus on this journey, beginning with book 1 and 1, 2, and I think 5. 1 second. Yes, through books 1, 2, 4, and 5. That's for Thursday, inshallah. And on Thursday, we will discuss, we will go into the issue of alienation and the issue of alienation and anguish, and what is meant by authenticity, right? Alienation and anguish as embodied in the scene that the book begins with, which I really want you to reflect on. The great commander general, stranded on a shore, weeping and crying, serving as a sex slave, so to speak, for Calypso. Okay, guys, see you on Thursday.